so-called conventional understanding of confidential, very strict auditing rules that they don't have to disclose it to everyone, but only to the commission on audit. But you don't have to on intelligence difficult because you have the military, which is flush with all kinds of these funds. But I already saw at that in that position that this was also used for waste, if not outright corruption. But just given to you as a lump sum, you spend it the way you want, and then you just account for it at the end when it's too late. So that's the policy argument. Now the political argument, your question of what is going on behind the scenes, basically. I'm sure your insights are far better than mine here, but let me just specify something. I think every Filipino who pays attention already knows this is a Marcos Duterte fight. And that's the tragedy because Filipinos are victims of both Marcos and Duterte. And so why would you pick one side over the other? Why would you think that Marcos is a more honest person than Duterte? Why would you think that Duterte deserves to be believed against Marcos? These are just people fighting for spoils. These are people fighting for who gets to steal more and who gets to kill more. And that's the tragedy of this debate. And you can see that playing out in the media coverage of newspapers that are owned by the Marcos Romualdez family. Why is the Inquirer, for example, covering it in a way that it wouldn't cover Martin Romualdez donating $2 million? At first, everyone thought it was just $1 million.
The Tagalog Studies Fund in Harvard.
Filipino Tagalog language program. It turns out to be $2 million. And I was interviewed for that, and the article came out at first, and then they took it down. So you can see here that this is more than just about transparency and accountability for confidential funds. It's Marcos against Duterte fighting for control over the spoils of government.
More like Marcos via Romualdez versus Duterte.
Yes.
Because if you look at BBM himself, he tries to be above the fray, and I think that sort of plausible deniability is very important. But before going to that Bardagulan and the whole Tambaluslos one, let me rewind a little bit. Exactly. That's the reason. The reason why I wanted to ask you, Attorney Carranza, is because you serve in the Department of National Defense, which is national defense, right? All of these things we're hearing from the Duterte's about defense. Well, that is your job when you're in that Department of National Defense. But you're also with PCGG, which had to do with good governance. So the question basically here, Attorney Carranza, is under what I know you're categorically skeptical, to just put it nicely, but for the sake of argument, under what circumstances can a confidential fund make sense? So for instance, we had Secretary Llamas as a guest, and he talked about how Pinoy, as the president, they had, quite minimal compared to what comes later on under Duterte, but nonetheless, the president had a confidential fund. And then what are the safeguards, or what is a golden mean? Like a while ago, you said something like, it doesn't have to be confidential fund, but it can be somewhere like you can just report to the Commission of Edit, because if you give too much details, then if it's a national security relevant one, then alam ng kalaban anong ginagawa mo. Kunyari, you cannot say bumili ka man ng 10 AK-47 or 10 ISR. I mean, so obviously there is an argument to make. But what's the golden mean, and what are the circumstances under which you think confidential fund makes sense? Because under the Aquino administration, the president had confidential fund, although nothing close to what will come later under Duterte or BBM.
It's both a cultural and a legal issue. Legally, you do have an argument for not disclosing how you will spend certain line items in your budget because they're confidential, because they're intelligence funds. And you can have a rule legally where you only allow certain agencies rather than certain activities, right? Agencies, not activities, to have access to these types of funds. So that narrows it down considerably. You can have national defense, you can have the PCGG, you can have national intelligence agencies. the National Bureau of
You mean
Investigation.
tugma dun sa mandato nila? Talaga tugma sa training at
Right.
mandato nila. Oo.
Right, but I wouldn't stop there legally because within that group of agencies, you still have to narrow
Yeah.
exactly why they will spend this money for
Right.
what. And that's where the trouble is because even within those agencies, there's a lot of corruption. Even within these agencies, there's a lot of non-accounting of how this money is spent. They would usually say reward money. They would say money for confidential informants, money for whistleblowers, uh, then call it that, right? Put it in the
Right.
budget as money for whistleblowers or money for confidential informants. Obviously, you don't have to detail who the confidential informants are. There's a witness protection program, for example, in the
Right.
Department of Justice. That's allocated as a line item in the Department of Justice budget for witness protection. Do you need to specify the witnesses you protect? No.
Right.
So there, in other words, you do have a civilian example of what these military and police agencies ought to do when they want access to these types of funds. But on the cultural side, that's the problem. This always comes down to power. That these people think that dispensing power requires access to corruption. That's really what it is. They obviously you cannot put a budget line for corruption, so you call it something else, confidential fund.
And if you ask what's going on, well, it's confidential, right? You just lock it that way. Now,
Yeah, it's a tautology, so it's
medyo,
ridiculous and
I know. Well, just for technicality purposes, what's the difference between maintenance and other expenses, yung MOE? Kasi, kunyari, itong
mhm.
ginawa nila, oh, hindi na confidential sa DepEd, lalagay na lang natin sa MOE. Like,
Mm.
what's going on there?
Well, in government accounting, that should have been very basic, right? Maintenance of your facilities, of what you do
Right.
day to day, so everything you usually do, and other expenses, and that already covers salaries, that covers gasoline, that covers things that make you function. Um, that's spying. Is spying part of your regular activity? Now that's where the arguments you already know come in, right? Why would the Department of Education need money to spy on people? Then maybe you're not educating, you're spying. So I think that's the difference. And when politicians get away with stretching this concept of what a line item in a budget is for, it's meant for this, but not for that. You might as well get rid of the budgeting process. You might as well not have any of these distinctions because you might as well not have a commission on audit and just leave it to congressmen and senators to decide how much will be stolen from corruption for corruption and how much will be left to spend on the public.
Attorney Carranza, are you, I don't know if the word impresses right, but are you surprised that the Commission on Audit, regards of changes in leadership, we can debate about whether the right persons are now there, etc. That in fairness naman, it looks like pretty
Mhm.
consistent sila in, well, indirectly exposing some gaps, loopholes, if not anomalous practices out there. And at the same time, you also have the Office of Ombudsman coming out now and essentially telling them, hey, to back off, something along those lines. I mean, and then you have also people, I don't know, Congressman Richard Gomez, something like, wag niyo masyado i-publicize para hindi mapaya yung ibang tao. May mga ganon, no? So parang, what's going on here? I mean, first of all, are you surprised that the Department of, I mean, the audit folks have not been neutered? Or is this just
Mhm.
like performative transparency and then that's really it? Because you can be cynical and say, of course, this is part of the performativity. See, my commission on audit naman, in-expose naman. So we're a democracy, we're
Right,
functioning. You know what I'm saying? Like there could be levels of cynicism there. But for
right.
ombudsman to come in and all, is this a next level kind of thing going on because we have a Duterte and BBM in power, or not?
And that's actually the right starting point to answer you because once a country elects a family that stole $5 to $10 billion from them, there is no bar anymore to outrightly defending corruption. So when the Ombudsman of the Philippines, who's supposed to be a constitutional office that checks every single branch of the government, even to some extent, the Supreme Court comes out and says, we don't have to publish the statement of assets and liabilities of public officials. It's essentially saying, they can commit corruption in secret. We don't have to show how much they earned from corruption. And that's because when you're a country that elects the Marcoses, puts them back in power after they stole billions from you and lie about it, then there is nothing that stops people like an ombudsman who got appointed by Duterte. There's nothing that prevents corrupt politicians from coming out now and saying, we don't have to be checked. We don't have to be required to disclose our income. We don't have to be exposed to public scrutiny. Because what? You're not public officials? That's the problem. The Commission on Audit functions because you have a bureaucracy in place. And to that extent, that's the value of having a civil service that isn't affected by political change to a large extent. But as we know, the Civil
Professionalized.
Service Commission, as an example, it's fine from a certain salary grade downward. The problem will be in appointing higher level officials. The same thing with the Commission on Audit. They audit mayor's offices, they audit fire departments, and then you find out that a fire department, bought a truck secondhand but describe it as firsthand, and everyone goes to jail for that. You find a city market treasurer absconding with money, and she goes to jail for that. But not Imelda Marcos, right? Who stole 500 times more than anyone else in the Philippines. So did the Commission on Audit play a role in checking her? Of course not, because the Commission on Audit was headed by someone close to Ferdinand Marcos during the dictatorship. When Chofisto Gingona Sr. became Commission on Audit chair right after the dictatorship, there was an audit of all the Marcos debts and all the foreign aid that was sent to the dictatorship, and that's when they found out that the Marcos dictatorship, for example, used USAID money for Imelda Marcos shopping spree. So while we think the Commission on Audit does its job, and these are bureaucrats and civil servants who are professional, who follow certain standards, that's fine. But I think we need to have them do more than what they're used to doing with regular government agencies that have little money and therefore little corruption and therefore not much to check.
I saw I don't know, was it authentic or not? May nag-circulate online na some sort of a Malacanang document na intelligence or confidential fund for Imelda or something like that. I mean, can we talk about the genesis of this whole practice? Is this an Imeldific Marcos legacy thing, or is this something common among developing countries and we just copied from someone else? How original is this whole confidential fund saga?
Dictators everywhere, not just the Philippine dictator, have always, for some perverse reason, tried to find legal excuses for their corruption. Why they do that, I think, I think has to do more with outward appearance towards people other than their citizens than to their citizens. So other dictators commit corruption. Augusto Pinochet was corrupt. The Argentine junta was corrupt. South Korea's Chun Doo-hwan and the other dictators that followed him were all corrupt. They were also brutal, but we're talking about corruption. So it's not exclusive to a Filipino dictator. What is exclusive is the fact that we re-elected the same people who stole from us.
So may
Augusto
only in the
Fujimori of Peru
Philippines.
was corrupt. Right. Augusto Fujimori was a corrupt Peruvian dictator. He was ousted. His daughter tried to run for president. She lost.
Three times
So
she ran? Like how many times now? I've lost count of her. Yeah.
you do have this daughter of one of the former dictators of Korea running and actually winning, and then exposed for corruption and forced to
Yeah,
resign.
Kyung-ha,
So
Park Kyung-ha, yeah.
that document maybe we're talking about I don't know, this memo that tells the Philippine
Yeah, yeah,
National Bank
exactly.
to give Imelda Marcos her shopping money when she arrives. There's a PNB branch here in New York, so that's the same branch that gave her money, and then they take it out of the
Sarap
so-called
buhay
intelligence
eh.
fund, which is just rigmarole. Because what's the point? You're a dictator, so you don't even have to account for. It's just PNB, like I said, trying to show to its foreign banking partners that there has to be some way to justify what is going on. But really, internally within the dictatorship, they couldn't care. Imelda Marcos, for instance, converted part of the National Food Authority's money into an intelligence fund, stole from the NFA, the same agency that is now in charge of trying to lower the price of rice in the Philippines. So kahit yung kahit yung ahensya na nagpapatakbo ng pagkain at ang presyo ng bigas sa Pilipinas, tinakawan ng mga Marcos. In fact, the Sandigan Bayan ordered them to pay what was found, only what was found, lost 10 million pesos. Hanggang ngayon, hindi pa binabayaran ni Imelda Marcos. So, ginawang intelligence fund ang pera para pambili ng bigas.
The reason I asked this is because dun sa isang podcast ko with Leloy Claudio, of course we go history, right? We talk about all sorts of secret history of the Philippines. One of the things that we discussed was how actually the term crony capitalism is perhaps a Philippine invention that
It is.
way before talking about the Russian oligarchs and all of that na-invento ng Pilipinas. Kaya in that context, I ask you the question if this intelligence confidential fund tradition, if I can put it, if this is another only in the Philippines or ano, authentic contribution natin to humanity. That's why I ask about it, no? But I have another question, Attorney Carranza. Mm, of course, there's the aspect of, to put it mildly, performative transparency or rule of law, right? Because you want to show to the world, no, no, we operate by rule of law, and that's what makes modern dictators. I mean, old despots didn't give a heck. They would just massacre half of the villages, and they'll say, "You're my subjects." The difference with the modern dictator is that they pretend that there's institution going on there. But the other thing I've noticed, especially since the Duterte's coming to power, is what we call securitization, right? This idea that you try to shut down any kind of rational evidence-based debate by saying no, 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 this is a matter of national security. So nung kino-question yung confidential fund, and later on this will be relevant as we discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because actually the context of the term securitization starts with how things disoperate in countries like Israel, for instance, under certain right-wing administrations. But speaking of the Philippines, we see with Duterte's, no, if you question, for instance, si Sara Duterte, diba, nung kino-question yung kanya confidential fund, she immediately goes there at an event with some police folks and says, yung mga nag-question ng confidential fund, effectively sila yung kalaban ng bayan, di ba? Parang it's next, it's not even like defending herself on good governance ground. It's immediately, pushing it back to you, and not only gaslighting, it's something even more I would say menacing for some people. Is this something new in your opinion, or don't you think this makes Duterte a bit different from our current version of Marcos? Because at least in the case of Marcos Jr., don't see him doing that securitization thing, right? Well, with Duterte, that's quite consistent from the father to the daughter.
I think when you've stolen $5 to $10 billion already, there's really no need for
Ano
you
yung busog ka
to.
na, solve ka na, ganun pa yung argument mo.
Well, yeah, to some extent, yes, but also to the extent that you've done it with um, over 20 years, and you needed 20 years to do it, and you needed 20 years of brutal dictatorship to do it. Um, you probably think that it's enough of a lesson for you to find another way to commit corruption without having to go through the brutality of it, and not because you don't want to be brutal, but because it takes too long. And with the internet, with social media, with so much transparency available, it's not going to be something that you could do the way you did it 20,
So you're
36
suggesting
years.
some learning curve here, like strategic learning, kind of like game theory.
Right,
Okay.
right. And for the Dutertes, That's why they had to kill so many people when they were in Davao, when Duterte was president, because they only had a short time to do the kind of brutality that they could do nationwide. And in some ways, you might be tempted to think, is this a distinction between a sophisticated set of oligarchs versus a very crude set of
I think
oligarchs?
the term we use is old new rich versus new rich, to put it mildly.
Right. And then to an extent, maybe that's true as far as their appeal to their populist appeal is concerned. Right. One is this, totally honest about the murder he wants to commit and has been committing. The other relies on lying to deny the corruption that they commit. So, which one do you want? A brutal murderer or a dishonest plunderer? Diba? Yun yung choice mo. Doon ka ba sa sinungaling na magnanakaw o doon ka sa hindi sinungaling na mamamatay tao? Like, what
Doon
kind
na
of
lang
choice
ako
is
sa
that? But
ano,
that's the
Ruben. Doon na
choice.
lang ako sa party boy. Grand Prix, Formula 1. Medyo
Right.
happy
Except
life.
that now you have, as you suggested before we start, now this honest plunderer will create a fund so that they can consolidate all their corruption, and they can steal not in retail terms, hindi doon pa isa-isa sa NFA, magnanakaw ako sa probinsya ko, magnanakaw ako doon sa Ministry of Agriculture. Instead, nanakawin ko na lang yung pinakamalaking assets being held by my largest financial institutions, my central bank, my government-owned bank, and call it something that honors my plunderer father. I'll call it Maharlika Fund. So it's you have a plundering family that has mastered plunder and is now carrying it out. On the other hand, you have a crude murdering family that is still trying to make sure it consolidates power, but has already left a trail of blood and bodies and is trying to transcend that legacy. So it's a terrible set of choices, and there are no good choices in it. I think you were a more so, if you were presenting yourself as an alternative to these two sets of terrible choices, you'll have to address both corruption and human rights violations and say, there has to be something better than just choosing between a corrupt family and a violent family.
Attorney Carranza, since you're in the United States, let me ask you this question. Um, I'm getting a lot of people asking me, especially from abroad, especially those who are beginning to turn against BBM because it's perceived to be hindi na pro-China, right? So you can guess who are these people. People in, they're saying, oh, these Americans, they may have offered something to the Marcoses, and that's why Marcos is so nice to them. I mean, how much do you think is there to that? Because it's not like Biden controls the courts, right? I mean, the Marxists have pending court cases, to put it mildly, right? It's not like Biden can tell these courts what to do, right? But does the Treasury Department, for instance, have some leeway in terms of dealing with alleged funds parked in, I don't know, Caribbean or something like that? Assuming this conspiracy theory is true, I mean, how much leeway does the Biden administration or any American president have to supposedly hook in the Marcos? Because that's the argument that many pro-China people are saying, that, oh, Marcos was our boy, except Americans offered them a nicer deal. And they say, I don't know about that. And of course, for me, it's ironic. Oh, you didn't have any issues when there were all those pogo and questionable things under the there. Now suddenly you're
Mhm.
concerned about corruption in the Philippines. But I want to ask you, like, honestly, like, realistically, what can Biden really offer if he were to be completely realpolitik about this, because he cares about China, containing China, therefore let's give Marcos whatever he wants. Assuming that's the case, theoretically, what is the leeway there?
2 years ago, in the middle of summer and the pandemic, I was asked to testify by the Department of Justice here in a case against the Marcoses or involving stolen Marcos assets, still being litigated in New York. And the Department of Justice was very serious in supporting the Philippine claim to those assets. In other words, this was an offshoot of the Aquino administration, Benigno Aquino's administration, claiming these assets. These are paintings that were stolen by Pharaoh Vilma Bautista, the Imelda's aide from
Right.
the New York properties of the Philippines, and then hidden for a long, long time. And they came out and they were taken back by the Department of Justice. And I helped them in that measure as well many years ago. So they finally asked me to testify and say, where did these assets come from? Did the Philippines know that these paintings were being hidden? And I testified on that. But the point I'm making here is that the Department of Justice uh, does what it has to do when it comes to pursuing Marcos assets, when it comes to supporting Philippine government claims against the Marcoses. Because it's a professional bureaucracy. They
Exactly,
to a
exactly,
very large extent they're insulated from changes in
exactly.
administration, and not that there is no way to corrupt that process, not that there is no
Mm,
way to undermine that process. There's constant undermining of that process, not just under Trump, but even presidents before him. But the difficulty here
yeah,
is that you have other interests trying to make sure that the Department of Justice does not lean on one side or the other because everyone has an agenda. And so, in the end, everybody with an agenda has to arrive at a consensus and a compromise of sorts. That maybe let's let the DOJ do its job. I'm saying that because that
mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that there are no other ways to give Marcos what he wants in return for what the United States wants from Marcos. And I'll give you an example. You mentioned the U.S. Bureau of Treasury, which, among other agencies in the U.S., administers sanctions and
Exactly.
freezing of assets based on various laws that more or less allow the United States government to freeze assets to prevent travel by refusing U.S. visas, or even to order the arrest if they appear
Right.
on U.S. soil of persons who are not just convicted but even just suspected of corruption or human rights violations. And the Filipinos know one
Right.
example of that, Kiboloy, right? Son of God or whatever he whatever he claims to be. He's he's not just under FBI investigation. He's subject to these sanctions. One of the more prominent examples is the Global Magnitsky Act sanctions
Right.
for corrupt officials, for human rights violators. The United States government doesn't impose sanctions, freeze assets, prevent travel based on some objective, applicable to everyone criteria. They use these tools of accountability to promote their power, to pursue their foreign policy interests, to support America's military might
So
elsewhere.
there's
In
a
other words,
strategic
it's a political
prerogative.
tool,
Yeah, so there's a
right?
strategic
And
prerogative. Yeah. Mm-mm.
and the fact that they haven't used this on Marcos, and to some extent did not use this on Duterte himself, but on certain individuals around Duterte, under pressure from the U.S. Congress, by the way, shows you that the U.S., by not doing anything against the Marcos family when they could have, when there is legal basis to do so, is giving Marcos what he wants.
Thank you for clarifying that. Exactly, because my argument is, for all the ills of American democracy, their courts are not banana republic courts, right? They have their own logic. And in fairness, we saw even under the Trump administration, despite tremendous amount of pressure he tried to put on many agencies, there was a fight back, there was a resistance. I think the term was I think was that the steady state, right? Remember that anonymously written
Mhm.
NYTPs. Now, of course, we're not exaggerating the healthiness of American state institution, but this is not the Philippines, just to put it mildly. This is not a banana republic, all right. But as I said, my sense is if there is a place where there could be prerogative or room for maneuver is the Treasury Department's enforcement or pursuit, right, of certain questionable personalities or individuals and all. Because the reason I know that is because, for instance, we know that the Department of Treasury in the U.S. has tremendous amount of leeway on how to strongly go against American rivals, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, right, whether it's in Iran, for instance, on tech transfers, on oil
Mhm.
all transfers, etc. So clearly, there's a lot of room for maneuver and prerogative there, right? So I just had to clarify that this is not a case of Biden telling courts to drop Marcos anti-Marcos cases. That's not how it
He
works.
can't because those decisions are already final. So
Exactly, it's not
as
gonna work
far
that way.
as those cases are concerned, all he could do, which he did, was to allow Marcos Jr. and Amy Marcos to visit the United States. That's why all of a sudden, like, how was it that Amy Marcos never went to Hawaii? Like, you don't see pictures of her in Hawaii because she couldn't go. She would have been arrested. She fled to Morocco, got a passport there. How is it that Bongbong Marcos, the last time he was in Hawaii was 1995, if I'm not mistaken, never went back? Because that time he was allowed by the U.S. District Court in Hawaii to visit. At that time, there was no contempt judgment yet against the
Yes,
family.
yes.
So he was allowed to visit provided he would testify, and he did. So these people suddenly have an itch to travel to the United States. Why? Because the Biden administration allowed immunity, temporary for as long as they're in power,
Sovereign
to be
immunity.
given to them.
Yeah.
Once they're out of power, the U.S. courts can absolutely enforce their judgments against this family.
Wait, the sovereign immunity also applies to Amy? Or I mean,
No, these are all in the case of Amy Marcos. Let's go technical here. She is not part of the contempt judgment in the District Court
okay,
of
she's
Hawaii.
not. Yeah, okay.
Why? Because it's only Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Imelda Marcos who
Right.
were held in contempt because they're administrators of the so-called
Correct.
assets of Marcos Sr.
Yeah, I had to clarify that because sovereign immunity, you're talking about president, head of state, right? Yung iba naman, hindi naman head of state. Yung iba, so parang I was wondering.
Right.
Okay, now it perfectly makes sense. Thank you for that. Now, and I think this is a perfect transition to what we really want to talk about. Let's talk about Duterte and then let's go to his pals on the other side, right? ICC. So, what is your sense with ICC so far since last time we talked vis-a-vis Duterte? And I think that's also a segue for our next part of conversation because Duterte had his own ideas about how to deal with the Gaza situation, right? With his friend on the other side, who right now is also coming under a lot of criticism, and people are also talking about war crimes being committed. But let's talk about Duterte first before we transition to the very thorny issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Kamusta si Duterte? Well, how's the ICC situation in your opinion?
The ICC prosecutor has won the appeal against the original decision by the prosecutor to open an investigation, right? So that was challenged by the Philippine government under Marcos Jr. So there are obviously still political compromises and negotiations between the Marcos and the Duterte families going on back there. But at the ICC, that doesn't matter. So the investigation has been approved. Um, Technically, what should happen now is for the prosecutor to file the charges at the trial chambers
Mm-hmm.
and ask that chamber to issue either a warrant or summons to whoever he says should be summoned or issued a warrant for. That hasn't happened. And largely, the reason that doesn't happen is, well, two reasons actually. Resources. The prosecutor does not have enough resources to spread around. But that isn't really, well, that in part is the fault of the prosecutor and also the states that are members of the ICC in terms of funding, but also because this particular prosecutor has been a prosecutor that wants to please Western governments, opens an investigation into Ukraine, but refuses to act on a 2-year-old investigation in Palestine. So that's, if you want to segue there later, we can segue
Yeah,
there. But
an
there's a
issue that is more poignant now than ever, right? Yeah.
right, and there's a second reason why the Duterte case has not moved forward. They can move it forward. They can issue warrants of arrest, but they can't force Duterte or anyone that who might be charged in the Philippine situation to appear at the Hague in the so-called confirmation of charges hearing. But even before you get to that, there are other possible openings for litigating this case. The Philippine government and later on Duterte could still challenge these charges. So there's a long way to go. And I think that Filipinos who are awaiting this, again, I always say this, the ICC is not the only way to get justice for victims of the drug war. In the Philippines, you can have justice for victims of the drug war by letting them tell the truth about what happened to them, who these people are who were killed. So don't pin all your hopes on the International Criminal Court. At the end of the day, justice is better when it's done at home because you can build a better home for justice.
So what you're saying is the shadow of ICC being there is not the bad thing necessarily, pero wag tayong umasa doon. At the end of the day, we have to
Yes.
push it in turn. So that's an important point because I think that was not as much fleshed out in the past, and I think every time you and I talk about ICC, there's a lot of excitement and expectation, and I'm not sure it really captures the essence of the struggle at hand here. So thank you very much for emphasizing that. Now let's go to this issue. It's a sensitive issue. Obviously, may mga kababayan tayo na namatay. Some of our kababayan are suspected to be held hostage. More than a dozen were freed, thank God. So emotions are very high, including for us Filipinos, because some of our kababayans were killed by the militant groups from Gaza who invaded Israel over the weekend. Now, the thing is, many talk about the right to self-defense, which is enshrined in international law, but also there's the notion of proportional use of violence. There's a notion of avoiding war crimes. There's a notion of state responsibilities in the case of occupied territories, right? And my sense, Ruben, is if you go online, it's either those, anti-Israel people, through and through, and then they're those people, and most of the time I think the Philippines, the case is like they're just gonna blame everything on Hamas, right? And my sense is if the discourse is at just that level, we're gonna miss a lot, right? A lot of truth, but also we're not gonna appreciate what's happening as you and I are talking and what's about to even happen in the coming days, because it looks like we're looking at a very, very scary situation in terms of civilian casualties. So, obviously, you and I, Ruben, as any decent human being, we oppose any indiscriminate or deliberate use of violence against civilians for any political objective. That's a war crime if you're a state, and if you're a non state actor, that's an act of terrorism, right? So, we're very clear about that. Having said that, many are saying there seems to be an imbalance of empathy here, and also people forgetting, first of all, Palestinian civilians are human beings too, and their lives matter. At the same time, you're hearing this rhetoric coming from people at a very high level. You can guess where these people are saying, "Oh, what innocent civilians are talking about? Hamas would not have been able to do that if what I'm saying." So for me, this is very scary. I mean, this is a very troubling kind of rhetoric, and I think many people, because they're just so heartbroken, and for good understandable reason, with the barbarity and violence last week, suddenly I'm not sure they're appreciating the responsibility of a state when you're talking about invasion of a place and close place like Gaza with 2 million people at least, and hundreds of thousands of children, and based on the latest numbers, thousands of civilians have already been killed based on some of the numbers we're seeing. Ruben, as an as a human being, as a Filipino, as an international human rights person, can you explain to our folks, what's really going on here? What are the things they have to keep in mind if as far as international law is concerned, as far as human dignity and human rights is concerned? Yeah.
Well, maybe a story, can encapsulate something for listeners of your podcast to understand, not necessarily agree with or sympathize with or even condone. Right? But here's a
Exactly,
story.
exactly. Yeah.
I did work in Palestine, and I visited twice in that work, and I have done work between those visits. In one of my visits, I went to a hospital in the West Bank. It's one of the very few hospitals for Palestinians that has a
Ruben,
cancer
can I
ward.
just stop you? Just to be clear, okay, so West Bank is separated from Gaza, there is no Hamas in West Bank. Because I keep on hearing, oh, this, sorry na lang kasi andun yung Hamas. Let's just be very clear. This is in West Bank when there's no
Mhm.
Hamas. And this is completely
Okay.
separated
Yeah,
physically
right.
because Gaza is a strip close to the Mediterranean bordering Egypt. West Bank
Mhm.
is bordering Jordan. The other thing, of course, Ruben, people tend to forget is a lot of Palestinians are Christians like Filipinos, they're
Mhm.
Christians, right? There are even Christians inside Gaza, but there are a lot of Christians. I think Nazareth, right, where Jesus came from, that's is in West Bank area in Palestine. So these
Mhm.
are some things I, for some reason, many people don't seem to have any idea about, right? And they're giving
Right.
this kind of is
And
yeah.
Filipinos think this is just all the Holy Land. If your history is based on the Bible and you forget that there's a Quran or there's a Torah, that there are different books used by different people for their religions, and if your sense of history is that it only began last week when Hamas went inside Israel and started killing civilians, then you have to read more, you have to understand more, you have to listen to sources of information other than what you usually do. And you're right to remind people that when we say Palestine, we're talking about this large territory that includes what is now the state of Israel, but also includes the Gaza Strip, but also includes the West Bank, which, as you said, is separated from the Gaza Strip, and also includes the city of Jerusalem, what the UN classifies as occupied Palestinian territories. Officially, that's the legal name being used,
Yeah, occupied.
OPT,
So,
official.
sorry again for cutting you, Ruben, because I get a lot of responses on Twitter when you use the word occupied territories. They give it like, oh no, but it's not like IDF forces are there. And I said, no, you're missing the point. Can you explain to us why are those areas called occupied territories, even though you don't have Israelis per se physically occupying that area? I mean, I think people's idea of occupation is like, I don't know, invasion of Iraq, American troops there on the ground,
Right.
boots on the ground. Can you explain first of all yung occupied territory? Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's OPT. So the PT is Palestinian territories with an S. And there's a specific reason why they're called Palestinian territories, because they are not all of Palestine. Like I said, Palestine is the entire territory, which includes Israel, what is now the state of Israel, and these three areas that are considered occupied Palestinian territories. Occupied because they were literally occupied by Israel since 1967, but occupied because since 1948, right, when the state of Israel was created by British colonizers, essentially using the UN as their cover, all of a sudden, parts of Palestine became the state of Israel. So occupied in that way. But the three areas are Gaza, the Gaza Strip, because it's a narrow strip of land, the West Bank, and there's no way to go to Gaza from the West Bank without crossing into what is now part of the state of
Yeah,
Israel,
they're
and
separated.
East Jerusalem, which is the eastern part of Jerusalem. Old Jerusalem is, in fact, there, sacred to not just Jews, but to Muslims as well, and to Christians, right? So that's why Jerusalem, the old city, which is the
Yeah.
eastern part of the larger metropolis of Jerusalem, is well, if there's a holy land for everybody, that's holy land. So
Yeah,
these three areas
including
are not
Christian
contiguous,
Palestinians, right? Which people forget.
right?
Christian Palestinians too. Yeah.
And so these areas right now are occupied still, literally in the case of the West Bank. In the case of Gaza, Israel withdrew its forces after the Oslo Accords, forced to do so just because it was untenable for the settlers to continue living there. But
But they have control over the electricity and all of those things, right? I mean,
they,
tremendous.
they, they have control over every way to go in or go out. It's almost like you live in a building with multiple apartments inside. There are three apartments where Palestinians can live: Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. But the doors, the locks, the keys to these three apartments, everybody else, Israeli Christians, Israeli Arabs, even or even non-Israelis can live in, but only in these three apartments. Palestinians can live, but the doors, the locks and keys are controlled by Israel. So how do you go out? Only if Israel lets you. How do you go in? Only if Israel lets you. What if you want to rush out? Israel will kill you. So that's the situation. I'm oversimplifying it because in many ways, I think that's how crude it can get. And I was going to tell you the story of how not just crude but tragic it can get. I was in Palestine. Part of my work was to help the United Nations with a process in which it would record whatever damage has been suffered by Palestinians living in the West Bank because Israel began building a wall across the West Bank, starting from East Jerusalem, across the West Bank, to isolate Palestinian villages and to make sure that settlers allowed by Israel to occupy those villages would have a wall around them.
This is West Bank, right? This is West Bank when there's no
in the West
Hamas.
Bank.
Exactly. I want to be clear again. This is a part of Palestine which is not under Hamas. So yung mga nagsasabi, sisisihin na naman Hamas. Let's be clear. This is West Bank when there's no Hamas, and this is the reality they're facing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember this too. Hamas is just one of several Palestinian political groups. There's something called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has several groups within it. Hamas is not part of that. The Palestinian Liberation Organization includes one party called Fatah, initially led by Yasser Arafat, who was the most famous of Palestinian leaders. And Fatah won elections that were held in both Gaza and the West Bank. But in another round of elections later on, Fatah lost in Gaza, Hamas won, but Fatah kept power in the West Bank. Elections for what?
And there was a civil
Elections
war.
for the Palestinian Authority.
And there was a conflict, a lot of conflict between Hamas and Fatah. You know, it got bloody. So eventually Hamas took over Gaza, and West Bank is effectively under Fatah and PLO. Again, these are nuances. People think all Palestinians are just in Gaza and Hamas is in control of. That's not true. There's another side, no, to this that we want to discuss.
And more importantly, many Palestinians, millions of Palestinians, are not part of Fatah nor of Hamas. They're just regular Palestinians. Some of them have dual citizenship. There are Palestinian Americans. There are French Palestinians. There are Lebanese Palestinians. There are Arab Palestinians, just as there are Christian Palestinians. Palestinians are just like other people in the world where there are multiple identities, multiple religions. The only difference is that they have not been occupied for 75 years. And so when I was doing my work, I visited this hospital because this hospital was now enclosed by that wall built by Israel. And like I said, it's the only hospital with a cancer ward at that time, which means Palestinians that had cancer would go to this hospital. For people in the West Bank with cancer, you would now have to drive several hours around the wall, go through several checkpoints just to get your chemotherapy. Every day. Every day you suffer the indignity of spending half of the day just driving around a wall and going through several checkpoints manned by Israeli soldiers who will ask you, what are you going to do across the wall? And you will say, I will go through chemotherapy. Why? Why would you ask? I have cancer. So people could not just get treated for cancer easily. Now imagine if you had cancer and you lived in Gaza. And that's where the problems worsen, because then you would have to apply for a permit to travel across, out of Gaza, into Israel, and into the West Bank, go through this wall for hours, and then do your chemotherapy. How much time do you think would be left for you to do chemotherapy after this grueling journey? The other thing about this is that your permit is only good for 48 hours. So your chemotherapy may not even be completed. You will have to go back. The third point about this is that you can't just go as a cancer patient if you're too sick to go. You have to have someone go with you. In some cases, they refuse permits for that person. So I spoke with the chief doctor and he said, our patients are dying not of cancer, but from occupation. and and we are not even talking here about Hamas or violence
Exactly, exactly. I
or
mean,
armed conflict. We're talking of the day-to-day deaths and indignities and tragedies that Palestinians have been living for 7 decades. 7 decades. You can imagine that. So, how many generations, how many fathers and mothers, daughters and sons have gone through that? Grandchildren have gone through that. Generations of Palestinians. How much do you think can a human being take in a lifetime of indignities? And at what point do you think will a human being living in these circumstances suddenly decide, if this is going to be the life I will live, then I have to change it. And I'm not going to say that there's only one way to change it through violence, but I am not going to say that violence is not a way to change it as well.
Ruben, speaking of this, of course, what you always hear is, I mean, one of the parts of systemic dehumanization of Palestinians, right? Like implying that, a life of Palestinians is not worth as another life, let's say, the life on the other side. Is that this argument that, oh, these people, they don't like peace. They just want violence and they want to they want to erase, the state of Israel and all of that. And that's of course the context within which we have to talk about the Oslo Accords and multiple United Nations Security Council that made it very clear about what should be a just and reasonable border for Palestine, and going back to the pre 1960 war. Can we talk about this? Because uh, if you talk to a lot of legit historians, they'll say, well, there were peace negotiations, there were peace efforts, but they were not tenable to millions of Palestinians who felt that that's going to be peace without justice, right? And at some point, you had a situation whereby even peace negotiations were not even being, no one was even taking it seriously, right? Arafat is gone. On the other hand, you have a far right party in Tel Aviv, and for more than 10 years right now, I don't think the two state peace negotiations have been really going anywhere. I mean, if you don't believe us, talk to people like Barack Obama, right, who got a lot of headache and had a lot of issues with his counterparts, on the other side, because he felt this peace negotiation is not going to go anywhere. And of course, once Trump comes in, we know where Trump stands on things. Trump's focus was more on normalizing ties between Israel and Arab states, and of course that's something now is
Right.
potentially out of the table with the Saudi Arabians because of what's happening in Gaza. So could you just give it, again, people are free to read on their own, but just a kind of an overview of what is this whole Oslo Accords and all of these multiple United Nations Security Council? Because it's not like the Palestinians were not open to peace, but it's a question of, was that a genuine just peace, and should they have just you know hold their nose and just accept it? I mean, look, again, this is not to condone violence. I mean, and we're not even talking about Hamas here. We're talking about people in West Bank. We're talking about PLO here. We're talking about Fatah, Arafat, all of these kinds of people. Can you just give a summary for people who don't seem to have any idea about this part of history? Very important part of history.
Right. And there are many Filipinos, people who read, and not just Filipinos, but a lot of people who read and who think that reading about Israel and history of conflict in the Middle East, Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, that they've read enough, that they've read a lot, but they never ask themselves, whose words did they read? Who controls the outlets that they read online, for example? Are they listening to CNN? Do they listen to Al Jazeera? And if they listen to Al Jazeera, do they consider who the sources are, just as they don't even think about who the sources are being interviewed on CNN, for example? And so that you get a lot of people, again, Filipinos, non-Filipinos, who, just in their excitement, just summarize what they read and say, Israel already existed, or the Palestinians have always wanted violence. Again, based on media that isn't disinterested in this, that doesn't really try to get the Palestinian story out in a way that is at least faithful to a Palestinian narrative. In other words, there's one dominant narrative, and it's the narrative of Israel, and in many ways backed by the United States because of its security and political interests in having a non-Arab country right in the middle of a region where the United States still depends on oil and as its energy requirements are. So it's important for listeners right now to consider expanding the range of sources of information that they get. The Oslo Accords came about because of backroom negotiations sponsored by Norway and Norwegian activists to bring in people from leaders from Israel, leaders from the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, who were willing to negotiate. At this point, it had been clear that there were not going to be any other ways to end the violence without negotiations, without talking, which is just, in other words, just process rather than outcome. Outcome wasn't clear. What would your outcome be with this
Para siyang
negotiation?
ASEAN, it's like ASEAN negotiations, right? Of Code of Conduct South China. It's just talk every year, nothing really coming out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, and in many ways I can even support that it will always be better to talk about these disputes. They're intractable, they're long, there's a long history of colonialism and injustice that ought to be corrected, but because, as you said earlier, when when facts on the ground have been changed, you still need to consider those facts on the ground, no matter how unjust those facts on the ground have turned out to be. So it was important to talk, and they did talk. But there were people on both sides who did not want, not to talk, but who did not want talk without clear outcomes. And in many ways, they were vindicated by the outcome, because the outcome, you can argue that having these occupied Palestinian territories, OPT, that was the outcome. Having these three areas designated as under the Palestinian Authority, but it's not as simple as that, because Israel retained the power to enter these areas. Its military, its police, its government can still go into these areas, and it wasn't even the entirety of the West Bank. There's territory A, B, C, and only territory A in the West Bank will really be under some level of Palestinian control. B and C, still Israel, which is why B and C are now occupied by settlers, allowed to come in by Israel, and that wall was built to protect them.
Again, West Bank
So
where there's no Hamas. Again, we have to keep on
there's no Hamas.
reminding people because that's what you keep on saying when you say, "Oh, no, it's Hamas' fault. It's Hamas. This Hamas." These are places where there's no Hamas whatsoever. Yeah.
And even if Israel eventually, in part because of the Oslo Accords, withdrew its military from the Gaza Strip, uh, that wasn't that didn't change. Obviously, that didn't change the geographical situation on the Gaza Strip. It was still surrounded by Israel. There's a small border with Egypt, and the rest is the Mediterranean. There's water. That water, by the way, Israel has its navy basically 12, 20 miles offshore, so that Palestinian fishermen who dare go farther get shot. No ships can enter, which is why when there was a Turkish ship, not Turkish government ship, but a ship chartered
The
by aid
flotilla.
agencies
The
from
flotilla,
Turkey
yeah.
that entered, they were boarded by the Israeli Navy and killed. So Israel controls, like I said, in a condominium building where there are only 3 apartments for Palestinians, Israel controls not just the building, but even the corridors through which you go in and out of your apartment. So even if they withdrew their military from the Gaza Strip, they fenced the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip became, instead of an Israeli military base with Palestinians that just happening to live there, it became a prison with Palestinians being imprisoned there. That's the Gaza Strip. So imagine this. You have a very wealthy, Israel is a wealthy country, um, with people coming in, living in different parts of what used to be Palestine, um, you know, communities having agricultural access to food, to water, to day-to-day dignity, and there's just a a fence, heavily wired, patrolled by soldiers, and just across that fence is a country of 2 million that has little water, little food, no chance to travel, and relying completely on foreign aid to survive. So you can imagine the contrast. So the Oslo Accords essentially validated that situation. And that's why there was a lot of opposition. There is still a lot of opposition to the outcome of the Oslo Accords, including from Hamas, but not just Hamas, including several other Palestinian groups. Um, but the other thing about this is that the Oslo Accord, signed in 1993, did not just happen quickly in 1993. There was pressure from the United States, there was pressure from the Europeans, there was pressure from Israel for Palestinian leaders to sign the Oslo Accords. And let me tell you this, because a lot of our listeners do not know this. One of the sources of pressure, one way to pressure Fatah, the party that was holding the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, of the Palestinian Authority today, one of the ways that Israel pressured Fatah to force Fatah, by the way, is a secular party. It's not a
Yes.
party that says, religion is the basis of our
That's why
existence,
Hamas
that
came in reaction to that. Yeah.
Islam is,
No, it's not.
the
It's a
basis of the
secular.
creation of a,
Yeah.
it's a secular party. It's a party that relies on elections, that knows that Palestinians are a diverse set of people, not just Muslims, etc. So that's important because what Israel did was to secretly support the conversion of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a larger group of Muslim faith-based political organizations across the Middle East, across the world. There was a Muslim Brotherhood group in Palestine that's more religious, that's more fundamentalist in outlook, but it's also very political. And Israel supported the Muslim Brotherhood, and it became Hamas. Israel supported them so that there would be an alternative to Fatah if Fatah did not sign the Oslo Accords. Israel secretly provided funding and allowed the entry of resources for the Muslim Brotherhood that became Hamas, so that in case Fatah decides not to sign the Oslo Accords, it will have a rival, that it cannot govern Palestine, that even if it signed the Oslo Accords, it cannot do what it wants because there will be a competing political group that Israel could use or turn to. Israel considered Hamas an asset that it could use against Fatah. So this is, you reap what you sow. Israel, in many ways, helped create Hamas.
I mean, the thing is, speaking of the whole divide and conquer strategy you're implying here. I mean, for me, this is why the West, Britain, etc. They have to own up to it because much of the crisis we see today, not only in Palestine, Israel alone, Pakistan, India, I can go on and on. This and even parts of Africa, right? It's because of how the British, the colonial powers, just less than a century ago were promising different things. One via Lawrence of Arabia, one via Zionism, and they just left it, and now these communities are there. I mean, of course, you also sympathize with the other party, which had to fight multiple wars against multiple countries. I mean, in a way, this is a tragic story because all of them are, in one way or another, victims also of the horrors of colonialism and Second World War, right? The Holocaust happened in Europe, right? That's the horrible things that happened. It was Britain that had the mandate in Palestine and messed up the whole Balfour Declaration and what came after this. So my thing is that's why it's very important to have a deep sense of history, right? And the tragic thing is that we end up fighting each other, not forgetting that a lot of the problems we have right now is because of the colonial legacy we get. But that, of course, doesn't mean we
And
should
yeah,
ignore our agency and also not take responsibility for fixing that mess. But then again, I think this is why the West, especially Europe, has a historical responsibility of making sure this conflict is resolved in a just, sustainable way. And they cannot just be, innocent bystanders there because they contributed to
I
this.
think,
Yeah.
Richard, it's important to distinguish between Israelis, people who are citizens of Israel, and people who believe in the Jewish faith. The Holocaust targeted Jewish people, people who believe in the Jewish faith. There was no Israel during the Holocaust. So obviously, it was targeted at people of the Jewish faith, but it's also important to remember that it wasn't only people of the Jewish faith that were targeted by Nazis. Romani people, Sinti people, the so-called gypsies of Europe were
Slavs, they killed,
annihilated.
yes, Slavs too. They killed
Uh,
more Slavs than almost
right.
everyone, yeah.
And that's why you have Ukraine and certain groups of Ukrainians supporting the Nazis because they targeted non-Ukrainians in Ukraine. You have male homosexuals targeted by the Nazis, imprisoned, killed, brought to concentration camps as well. Did they create a state? Did they build a country from people who were already living there, taking away their land so that they could exist freely? They did not. So the Israeli project is different. It is not simply a reaction to the Holocaust. Israel was a deliberate effort to build a state based on this notion of Zionist principles. And so I think that distinction is important because you can be opposed to Israel's agenda politically and militarily, and yet not be anti-Semitic, not be against Jewish people of faith. You can be against the idea of genocide and be against the idea of genocide being committed by anybody, including Israel, including the United States, including Saudi Arabia and Yemen. In other words,
Or China for that
the
matter, yeah.
term genocide was coined by this Polish lawyer who was from a Jewish family. His name is Ralph Lemkin. And Ralph Lemkin coined the term genocide based on what he saw in Poland, in Nazi Germany, in Europe during World War II. And he campaigned hard for there to be a genocide treaty so that it will never again happen. There's a Ralph Lemkin Institute created in honor of Ralph Lemkin. And 2 days ago, the Ralph Lemkin Institute clearly said that genocide is happening in Gaza.
Ruben, I think we can come back to this. I mean, this is a very heavy and really uh, soulful, and it's in the heart and heart wrenching conversation. I mean, for me, I hope we all. I mean, wherever you stand on things. I mean, first of all, we have to be against systematic dehumanization of any group of people, regardless of creed, religion, skin color, etc. And that's why Nazism, fascism was such a horrible thing, right? They kept on dehumanizing different minority groups. So that's why that's something we have. That's why for me, the number one thing to emphasize is our shared humanity, and all civilians, everywhere they are, they have to be. Their rights have to be respected, even amidst war. That's why there are rules.
including the civilians who were killed, who were kidnapped, and now taken hostage by
Yes.
Hamas. And I think let me be very clear. I mean, it's to me. I think it's not enough to say legally these are war crimes committed by Hamas. I think it's also important to say that morally it's going to be very difficult, right, to claim that you are fighting for human dignity if you do not respect basic human dignity. And I think that's important to say. But that does not mean that history only started on October 7th when Hamas entered Israel and killed 1,200 Israelis and non-Israelis as well. You mentioned earlier that there were Filipinos on Thai and other foreign workers killed alongside these Israeli civilians, and you do not hear much about them from people
Western
who
media.
parrot Israeli propaganda. They don't seem to care that people who are not Israelis were killed alongside Israeli civilians. And that's why that's both the irony and in a way the truth of what we should remember when Rodrigo Duterte visited Israel and was hosted by Netanyahu. They went to Yad Vashem, which is the memorial for victims of the Holocaust that is established in Israel, and they both said, never again. These people who between them have killed thousands with impunity, invoke never again without any sense of irony. And that's the tragic part, because now, if we really believe in never again, then it's happening all over and nobody seems to remember what it means.
I mean, Duterte is potentially under ICC. The other one is being accused of by Israelis, by people in Israel of committing war crimes. But that's a conversation going on there, and I'm just
Mhm.
following this. And my thing is, how I wish I'll see more of, whether you're Palestinians, whether you're from Israel, whether you're from Philippines, categorically condemn any indiscriminate and deliberate violence against kids, elderly, etc. I don't care what's your religion, etc. This is what I want to hear. I hope to hear more from any side, and it has to go all sides. It cannot be just you demanding the people in Gaza to condemn it. What about when civilian? It has to be both ways, and I think that's the only way for us to restore humanity. Now, just to close on this note, I mean, obviously we're realistic now. Emotions are very high, vengeance mode. That's really what one side is in. But as more civilians are gonna perish on the other side, there's gonna be also anger across the Islamic world, across the Middle East, and there are fears that other groups like Hezbollah, for instance, in north to the north of Israel, could be involved. It could be even further expanded if things are not under control. So that's why, bilang Filipinos, we have an interest in people getting back to the peace negotiations and this not spiraling into a hate game and cycle of violence. Because if this keeps on getting out of control, I mean, who saw? I mean, very few people thought Russia will invade Ukraine, and it happened, right? Very few people
Mm.
thought this Hamas attack, this it could happen. So the idea that this could not escalate into a really, I mean, if you're in a Muslim country right now, I mean, I'm right now in Malaysia, right? If you go to Middle East right now, the way they're looking at this conflict is so different from what you see in Western media or also among us Filipinos, I'll discuss. It's totally different. You can imagine how they're looking at this, right? And I'm really worried. I'm really worried this could get out of control. And as tragic and horrible as the deaths of thousands has been, this could get even worse. And that's why I hope in the Philippines we stand with all lives, but we also stand for some genuine returns to some genuine peace negotiations, because millions of Filipinos are in the Middle East. And how I wish a day comes where our kababayans do not have to go to conflict zones to live their life,
To
to
work.
find the living.
Yep.
Yeah, it should be a matter of, you go there because your job requires you, and I will go to that region because I have to do research. But to be forced to work next to the conflict zone or in the conflict zone, our people do not deserve that. Our people deserve better than that. And that's why sana hindi tayo mag-elect ng kung sino-sino ulit, right? Which goes back to our
Mhm.
confidential fund and Maharlika fund and all of that conversation. That's the reason why we care about good governance, so that people are not desperate enough to go to these places. Because at the end of the day, as a Filipino, my heart is broken for seeing my kababayans getting killed in this conflict. And I'm worried and worried about what could happen to the rest as this situation
Yeah.
escalates.
Yan yung naghahanap buhay lang literally, because wala kang hanap buhay na mahanap sa Pilipinas. At kaya ka walang hanap buhay na mahanap sa Pilipinas dahil ninakaw ang pera na dapat siguro makakapagbigay sa iyo ng hanap buhay. And this OFW phenomenon started under the Marcos dictatorship, because the Marcos dictatorship decided that you know there was only one thing left for the Marcoses that they could not steal, which was Filipino labor. So instead, they turned it into a commodity. We're going to sell you to countries that need labor. That's how Filipinos ended up in the Middle East. And to some extent, that's in fact the main reason why the Philippines decided it would have to have diplomatic relations with these Middle East countries, because you would have to send Filipino laborers there, and it's going to be difficult to protect them and to send them there in the first place without diplomatic relations, including with Palestine. So the Philippines is one of those countries that technically recognizes Palestine.
On that note, thank you very much. I'm literally at 1% battery. I mean, I wanted to talk more to you, but I think that's a good. I know you have a long day. Thank you so much, Attorney Carranza. Hopefully, next time we talk, it's on a more positive note. As you can see, I'm a cool guy. I can talk about anything under the sun, but this is one of those topics whereby emotions are high, and we have to respect the victims and their loved ones and families. I don't care what religion, I don't care what country you come from, my heart goes to you. And of course, first of all, dun sa ating mga kababayan na nabiktima dito. Thank you very much, Attorney Carranza, for this heartfelt and very humane and at the same time very educational discussion. God bless. Thank you very
Maraming
much,
salamat din.
Attorney. Have a good day. God bless. Once again lang guys, I'll just get my charger mag-off na yung phone. Nako, naka-off yata itong phone ko. Okay, thank you very much again sa lahat na nakinig sa atin. I know medyo mahirap kasi yung topic na to because you have to be really fair. And really fair doesn't mean that you say one thing for this side, you say one thing for the other side. Obviously, alam natin lahat anong nangyari the other week, and of course nakikiramay tayo sa pamilya ng mga biktima, and we really feel bad about the horrible things happen. We have to condemn any kind of violence against civilians and all. For me, being fair is also making sure now we don't forget the humanity of other side. The humanity of ordinary people other side. And I hope we have a world whereby, no matter where you come from or in your base, when you see innocent civilians being killed somewhere else, you come out, you condemn it. If not openly, you do it in your heart. You do it in your prayers with the Lord. Okay? Thank you very much. I hope you appreciated it because dito sa discussion namin with Attorney Carranza, I wanted to also show itong what is the broader legal context. So you're more than free to research on your own. The reason we didn't go too deep into this is because we want to leave it to you folks to research it on your own, diba? Oslo Courts, United Nations Security Council resolutions on the 1967 border. Beyond that, you're more than free to discuss and look at how within Israel, for instance, there's tremendous amount of criticism of the government where they went short. You're more than free to um, you're more than free to ah anyway, thank you. Please, you're more than free to check all of these things on your own. Okay, so no, anything we say here is not out of thin air. We're keeping in touch with internal debates in Israel. We're keeping in touch with debate among the Palestinian community. We're keeping in touch with what the United Nations and the international community is saying, and we're keeping in touch with our Filipino community and making sure that they're in the right place. Because kung God forbid ito mag-escalate and this gets out of control, kawawa naman yung mga kababayan natin. Hindi lang dyan sa Israel and Palestine, pwede sa Jordan, pwede sa Egypt, pwede sa Lebanon, and this could even spread to the other parts of the world, including the Persian Gulf, among others, na milyon na mga kababayan natin. So, please lang, yung mga nagsasabi dyan, anong paki natin dyan? Richard, ano alam mo dyan? Well, marami akong alam, by the way, just to be clear. I've written a book about that whole region at the very least. Um, if we care about our kababayan, if we care about our humanity, we have to pay close attention to this. But we have to do it in a not partisan way, all right? And showing the humanity of one side doesn't mean you're biased against the other. That's ridiculous. I think it's important we remind everyone that Palestinians are human beings too and their lives matter. The same way that the lives of other people matter. The same way that the lives of our kababayan who were victimized matters. Right? And the fact that some people are turning this into a religious thing, as I said, they're Palestinians or Christians, just like Filipinos, Christians. So please, this is not about religion per se. It's about geopolitics. It's about politics. It's about failure of peace negotiations. So the least we do is we keep our humanity and keep our eyes open and keep our hearts open and try to research as much as possible. On that note, thank you very much. God bless. And please, if you disagree or anything, it's okay. Go and research on your own. You don't necessarily have to agree with our interpretation of things, but you can check things on your own. You can research Oslo Accords, Fatah, even National Security Council. What does it mean when you say occupied territory? These are things you can all research on your own. Okay? So we're not here to feed you opinion. We're here to just map out the situation, and from there, you're more than free to research on your own. God bless. Thank you very much, and have a good